On this anniversary of the attack near Ypres on the 31st of July 1917, was it Third Ypres or Passchendaele? What happened that day? And was it the blackest day in Flanders for the British Army through all 4 years of fighting here? Today is the 31st of July. On this day in 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres began in the area northeast of that Flemish city. Third Ypres is often referred to as the Battle of Passchendaele, and we'll discuss the naming of this operation later in the podcast. But for me, when I look back on those early years of visiting the battlefields of the Western Front, there are certain books that always stand out that helped shape my knowledge, my experience, and that have stayed with me really ever since. And Lynn MacDonald's They Called It Passchendaele is one of those. I remember going into the tumble-down corner of Foyles in London, the old Foyles, where the military section was, to hunt down this title. It wasn't available in my local bookshop, but I've been told that they had copies in Foyles, and there it was, and I absolutely devoured that book, the stories, the veteran stories within it. And I think ever since I've had a particular fascination with Passchendaele, with Third Ypres, and the events in that battle from this day, the 31st of July, through to its conclusion with the capture of Passchendaele village by the Canadians on the 10th of November. A year from today, it will be the 105th anniversary of the Third Battle of Ypres, and there are events planned around Ypres and in some of the villages connected with the battle, from reenactments to special exhibitions and commemorative services. And I'm hoping that the Old Frontline podcast will be on the ground at that time to be able to report back from it. More of that, obviously, in a year's time. But today, on this anniversary, and as the podcast goes out today on the 31st of July, I thought it would be a good opportunity to look at the battle, to see some overview of it, look at the events that took place from north to south along the British battlefront that day, and then examine the casualties of that day, which was the most costly day in Flanders in all 4 years of the war, again, as we'll discuss. But what was the road to Passchendaele? What led to the Third Battle of Ypres? Now, we've spoken about the long years of trench warfare, static trench warfare at Ypres quite a few times in the podcast. With the end of the Second Battle of Ypres and that first use of poison gas in April and May of 1915, the Germans had captured all of the high ground around the city. To the south, in 1914, they'd taken the Messines Ridge, and in Second Ypres, they'd taken all the high ground that encircled Ypres from the northeast round to the east, round to the southeast of the city. So there was a curvature in the line with Ypres at its epicentre, and that was the true creation of the salient, that curvature which you can see on the maps of the period. The Germans, for that 2-year period from mid-1915 to mid-1917, were essentially in command of the battlefield in terms of its geography. They sat on these bits of high ground, most of them just tens of metres above sea level, but on the flat Flanders landscape, that gave them the advantage. And there were minor operations such as the German attack on the Canadian positions at Hill 62, Mount Sorel, Sanctuary Wood and Hooge in June of 1916. But otherwise, in that 2-year period, it was all quiet on the Western fronts, in inverted commas. Day-to-day activities of trench warfare, thousands of casualties along the entire British front from Flanders down to northern France just by holding the line. And here at Ypres, unit after unit passed through here, learning about trench warfare, experiencing trench warfare, going on raids, coming under gas attacks and rifle grenades and trench mortars and artillery and machine gun fire, snipers, everything else, tunnelling, mining, wiring parties, everything that you can think of connected to that day-to-day experience took place during those 2 years. But by 1917, the Germans were still in command of that high ground. So that year, following the Battle of the Somme in 1916, which had occupied the British Army in terms of its offensive operations on the Western Front, 1917 saw the broadening, really, of attacks along the British sector, with Arras in the spring, and then the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. Now, this was a battle that had been planned long before this. Haig had it in mind to launch what was essentially the Messines offensive in 1916, but the Somme got in the way. And on the 7th of June 1917, 19 mines were blown along the Messines Ridge, rupturing the German positions there, causing devastation in many of the areas, and that in combination with artillery and the use of tanks and the infantry going forward meant that the Messines Ridge was essentially captured in a single day. We went from the western side of the ridge to the eastern side of the ridge, all of that high ground captured in one day on the 7th of June 1917. Now, once we'd taken the ridge, the Germans counterattacked, but we held. This is one of the things, again, that the British Army, the British and Commonwealth forces, Empire forces as they were then, were beginning to learn and understand, was the use of artillery and the necessity of artillery to support your troops once ground had been taken. So at Messines, with the capture of the ridge and the line moved forward, the guns moved forward quickly as well to establish new gun positions to protect that captured ground, and the ground held. That battle had been fought by General Plumer's Second Army, and with its great success, the obvious continuation was to push the Germans off the high ground in the northeastern part of the Ypres battlefields. So that bit of ground that ran from north of Ypres, where the lines met the Yser Canal that ran to the coast, it swung round across the Pilcolm Ridge, the Frasenberg Ridge, the Bellewaerde Ridge, around to that high ground of Hill 62, Observatory Ridge, and then down to the beginning of the Messines Ridge, close to Hill 60. The Germans were still in possession of that high ground there, and having captured Messines, it was obvious that the next phase would be the attempt to push them off that high ground too. And again, the investment in guns, in artillery, was part of the preparation for this Third Battle of Ypres. It was a roughly 15-mile front that they were going to attack across, and 281 heavy guns, 718 medium, and over 2,000 field guns were brought up to fire the bombardment. Now, this is massively higher than was used in many aspects of the fighting even earlier that year, let alone the Somme the previous year. And in this bombardment, which began on the 15th of July, 4,283,550 shells were fired at the German lines along that 15-mile front. This was a massive saturation of the German line with artillery shells. And if we look at the 281 heavy guns and the 718 medium guns, these would be from siege batteries and heavy batteries of the Royal Garrison Artillery, firing 60-pounders, 6-inch guns, right up to 12-inch railway guns onto the German lines. We see that the lesson of the Somme, the implementation of much heavier artillery at key points along the German lines, something that had been used at Messines and demonstrated even more there, was now an essential part of victory on the battlefield. So this massive bombardment began, and these millions of shells were dropped onto the German positions. But it wasn't just the standard artillery as well. There was now a weapon called a Livens projector, designed by Major Livens of the Royal Engineers. It was essentially a big metal tube that was buried in the ground and fired a large sausage-shaped projectile, which mostly had gas, poison gas inside it, although it could use a flame substance in it, which was a little bit like napalm. Not quite like napalm, but similar. Oil drums, they were called. But at Bosinger on the 13th and 14th of July 1917, and then again on the 20th and 21st, more than 4,000 Livens projectors fired a bombardment on the German line. Now, the reason they did that there is when they began the planning for this attack of the Third Battle of Ypres, the line there was along the Yser Canal, and to launch a major attack across a canal was considered to be inadvisable. So the idea was to try and bite off that bit of the ground first, and using the Livens projectors to saturate the German ground with gas constantly, plus artillery fire, you were attempting essentially to try and deny the Germans the occupation of that ground. And it was successful. On the 25th of July, It looked as if the Germans had abandoned their frontline positions along the Ypres Canal just in front of Boesinger village, and patrols went across and found them empty. And by the 27th of July, a new line had been established, roughly where Artillery Wood Cemetery is today, just east of the canal. And if I go back 20 years to when the diggers were working, doing their archaeology north of Ypres in this area around Boesinger, they found many of the Livens battery sites with the metal tubes that fired the Livens bombs still in place. And you can see a few of those if you go to Yorkshire Trench when you visit that preserved section of the battlefield there, which was kept to give some indication of the massive network of trenches that had once existed in that area. So with the bombardment doing its work, with the gas from the Livens projectors denying the Germans that bit of ground to the north and enabling British troops to cross the canal to establish a new jump-off position for the assault, the Fifth Army under Sir Hubert Gough was now ready to launch the attack here. Gough's Fifth Army had moved its headquarters to La Louvière Chateau near Popperinge in June of 1917 and had begun its preparation for the offensive. Gough had 18 divisions under his command, and if you think that the average division numbered about 20,000 men, this was a substantial amount of troops, and these men were occupying the frontline positions or in reserve between Ypres and Popperinge. And around Popperinge itself, many new camps had been created for the influx of troops for this battle. At one stage, there was nearly 150, 200,000 men encamped around Popperinge, and when you consider that in this Third Battle of Ypres, men from every corner of the empire, every corner of the Commonwealth came to serve here, it was a truly international force that sheltered in those camps and in those billets around Popperinge before going up the line to fight in this operation. But Gough's troops weren't fighting on their own. To the south, Plumer's Second Army also took part in an assault there between Hill 60 and Hollebeek. That's really deserved of a podcast of its own, and we'll probably return to that another day. And to the north was the French army. Now, we tend to think of the French army only connected to the battles of Ypres in the early stage of the war in 1914 and 1915, particularly during the gas attack. We sometimes forget that they returned to take part in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 and were also crucial in stemming the German advance in Flanders in April of 1918. Again, the French involvement in the Battle of Passchendaele probably deserves its own podcast. And we tend to think, perhaps, many people listening to this will think that perhaps the French army was finished after battles like Verdun or the mutinies following the Chemin des Dames, but operations like this here in Flanders, and indeed an attack at Verdun in 1917, showed that the French army was still in the game, and in many respects still ahead of the game in some of the things that it did on the battlefield. When we look at the battlefield that would be attacked on the 31st of July, it extended from that ground of Boesinger from a British and Empire perspective. It extended from that ground from Boesinger in the north, close to the Ypres Canal, and that newly captured ground, down across those ridges of Pilkelm Ridge, Frasenburg, Bellewaerde, the Menin Road Ridge area, and then down to the grounds around Observatory Ridge, and ending near to the village of Klein-Zillebeek, just close to Hill 60. The objectives ahead of the troops when they would attack across that ground was by nightfall to reach the Steenbeek River, the village of Langemark, and then across to Polygon Wood and to a position on the map known as Tower Hamlets. This planned advance, like Messines, would push the Germans off the high ground from north to south and reset the balance in terms of the geography on the battlefield. The idea was to keep pushing them back because northeast of Ypres, unlike to the south where at Messines there was one defined ridge and flat ground either side, here there was ridge after ridge after ridge. So once you pushed them off one, there was another, and you had to keep going until you got to beyond Passchendaele, and then you were in command of the Brunzeinde Ridge area, the Passchendaele Ridge area, which then enabled you to dominate the ground if you didn't then break out and advance northwards. And that was also part of the reason behind this offensive. The submarine bases up on the coast that the Germans were using, the U-boat bases to attack British shipping, were part of the objectives. Break out in Flanders, advance across the North Flanders plain, take those bases on the coast. That was part of the grand scheme of things. But as with many battles of the Great War, there were objectives laid out on paper that were probably never achievable, and that one certainly wasn't in 1917. But let's return to the battlefield area and look from north to south as to what actually happened that day. Now, we could look at each sector in great depth, and each one could deserve its own podcast. This is just an overview to sort of set the scene for when we eventually do come back and examine all these different areas where the fighting was, perhaps next year for the 105th anniversary. In that northern area, close to the village of Boesinger and the Ypres Canal, were the Guards Division and the 38th Welsh Division. They were attacking towards the northern part of the Pilkelm Ridge. Their objective was to get to the Steenbeck River and the village of Langemark. On their right was the 51st Highland Division and the 39th Division. Now, all of these units had extensive experience on the Somme the previous year. Some of them had experience back to the Battle of Loos. In the case of the Guards Division, it had been formed just prior to Loos in 1915. And although by this stage many of the original members of all of these formations had become casualties and were no longer in the fight, and that many of the men here on the 31st of July were conscripts, men who had been conscripted in the early phase of conscription in mid to late 1916 and were now on the battlefield. They were part of an army that had learned its lessons and was learning its lessons and was commanded by men who had extensive experience on the ground. So in that northern area, those four divisions, from the Guards to the Welsh to the Highland to the 39th, their task was to advance on that Steenbeck River and take the ground between Langemark to St Julian. To the south, St Julian was taken. The men of the Royal Sussex Regiment and the Hertfordshire Regiment were very heavily involved in the capture of the village that day, and the Highland Division to their north took that part of the Pilkelm Ridge, and the Guards advanced all the way to the Steenbeck River. But the Welsh got held up by a significant number of concrete bunkers, and this is one of the things that characterised the Third Battle of Ypres, was the construction and the implementation of concrete structures, defensive concrete structures, pillboxes, on different parts of the battlefield. And that gap between the end of the Battle of Messines in June and the beginning of the Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, gave the Germans the opportunity to construct more of these defences, which naturally they did. So in that northern area, while a lot of ground had been taken, not all of the set objectives had been captured. And this is something that you see along the rest of the line that day. So as we move towards the centre position of the attack, close to the village of Wiltshire, where the 55th West Lancashire Division, this was a Lancashire Territorial Division that included the 1st 10th King's Liverpool Regiment, the Liverpool Scottish, and we mentioned in a recent podcast in that area how Captain Chavasse, Noel Chavasse, the medical officer of that unit, went out and recovered the wounded from the battlefield until he was mortally wounded himself, and that resulted in the award of a bar to the Victoria Cross. Attacking on their right towards the Frasenburg Ridge was the 15th Scottish Division, and some of you may have been to the Scottish Memorial on the Frasenburg Ridge, which commemorates the role of Scottish troops there in 1917. They too were all stopped on the Steenbeck River. So the south of St Julian, across that ground towards the Frasenburg Ridge, was as far as they got. The river really marked the delineation of the advance, the successful advance in that early phase of the battle. And then to the south, the 8th, the 30th and the 24th Divisions, they were attacking in that area around the Bellewaerde Ridge. The central bit of their position was along the Menin Road, and then to the south towards Kleinzillerbeek and around Shrewsbury Forest. Here they came up against some stiff German opposition, and while in the centre area and to the north it was open ground, in this area there was a lot of woodland. Smashed woodland, of course, with the artillery bombardments, but that gave up its own problems in terms of advancing, particularly with tanks. So the southern area, they got about halfway to their final objectives on that day. And if we look at the end of the fighting on the 31st of July, the British have not taken all of the objectives that had been laid before them, but they've moved the line forward. And while there's not as much had been achieved in a single day as had been achieved at Messines in June, if you'd have been there on the ground at the time, I think it would have felt like a success. If you read Edmund Blunden's memoirs, he was there with the 11th Royal Sussex Regiment, and you get the sense that men like him who'd fallen on the Somme the previous year, to see just how far the advance had moved forward that day was something that was beyond their previous experience. But one thing began to happen on that afternoon of the 31st of July, and as it moved towards the evening, it got even more intense, And that wasn't German counterattacks, and it wasn't German bombardments. It was the rain, the pitter-patter rain. It began to rain, and it didn't really stop raining for quite some months over that period of 1917. It turned into the wettest summer in living memory. And that huge amount of artillery in that opening bombardment, over 4 million shells, had smashed the landscape to pieces, smashed all the traditional drainage, and it meant that when the rain came down, it flooded this landscape, flooded the trenches, flooded the shell holes, and turned the battlefield into a quagmire. And it's probably that vision of Passchendaele that we have more than anything. On that first day, it was advance over good ground. There were areas that were chopped up by the bombardment, but it was nothing like it was later on, not the moonscapes that we traditionally associate with Passchendaele. That was yet to come. And if we look at the operations on the 31st of July, it was in many ways a bit of a contrast in places, because there were tanks. The Tank Corps had just recently been formed under a royal warrant. The Tank Corps went into action with its Mark IV tanks, but even on that first day, they began to encounter problems with the landscape, and that would only get worse as the battlefield moved towards being that moonscape quagmire. To give you some idea, in the southern sector, for example, there were 48 tanks planned to be used in the attack there. Only 19 made it up to the start line, and all but one of those became a casualty in the operations on the 31st of July. So this was a battle in which tanks, now a vital part of the weapon, the toolkit that generals would use to fight battles here on the Western Front. Third Ypres and the ground of Third Ypres would show that they still had their problems. And in total contrast to the use of tanks that day, something that we probably don't even associate with the 31st of July, was the use of cavalry. In each of the areas where the advance would move forward, for example, to the Steenbeek River, it was planned to send cavalry patrols forward to reconnoitre the grounds as the infantry caught up. So a traditional use of cavalry in a reconnaissance role, not so much a cavalry charge, but there were rapid advances across the ground. The first King Edward's horse, for example, charged towards that Steenbeek River and suffered casualties. The official history talks about most of the horses were killed in a gallant effort to advance, but one of their squadrons went forward and captured a farm close to the river to enable that ground to be held as the infantry did move up and eventually reach that position. So tanks being used in areas, cavalry still being deployed, a massive amount of artillery. It is all part of that tipping point as the war moves towards the total war, the modern war, the industrial war, which had begun really with that first day of the Battle of the Somme, but still there were echoes of the old world, of the old way of warfare, and that would continue in some ways to almost the very end of the war. And before we end this overview, let's go back to what we spoke about at the beginning, the naming of this battle. Officially, this is the Third Battle of Ypres. If you look at the official history and the battle's nomenclature committee that decided the naming of these battles, this is what it's referred to. But for many people, it is the Battle of Passchendaele. Books like Le MacDonald's, they called it Passchendaele, and indeed many others besides perpetuate that naming of the battle. And I know many people listening to this get a bit crunched up when they hear Passchendaele instead of Third Ypres. And if we look at the actual fighting at the time, if you said to a Tommy on the ground in 1917, what battle are you in? They're not going to have replied, oh, I'm in the Third Battle of Ypres or the Battle of Passchendaele. Passchendaele at that very beginning of the battle would have been a name pretty much unknown to the men on the ground. So, for example, when I interviewed men from the Welsh division who took part in the assault near Boesinger on the 31st of July 1917 back in the 80s, they would always refer to it as the Battle of Pilkelm Ridge. And Pilkelm Ridge was the objective to which they were advancing towards. That was the name that they knew. Men were told these names at the times. Whether they all listened is another thing. And back in the 80s and 90s when I interviewed veterans, very often I would know more about the localities in which they'd served than they did, because, as one of them said, one smashed village was very much like another smashed village, in a landscape blown to pieces by artillery fire, with matchstick woods. Everywhere pretty much looked the same, and you couldn't always distinguish where you were. And it's an interesting thought that much of the naming of battles, certainly the names by which we know them now, come about not necessarily during the war, but after it, when the official historians, sat down and tried to make sense of these 4 years of conflict, to delineate them, to divide them up so we could perhaps better understand them. And that's an approach used by historians over millennia, I suspect. So whether we refer to it as Third Ypres or Passchendaele, what about the casualties that day? What about the 31st of July being a black day here in Flanders? That's what we'll look at next. While the 31st of July 1917 would be considered generally a successful attack, not all of the objectives had been captured that day, but the bulk of the ground had been taken and the line had moved forward. It was done at some cost. Between the 31st of July and the 2nd of August, there were 27,000 casualties in Gough's Fifth Army. That's killed, wounded and missing. They'd taken over 6,000 German prisoners and 25 guns when they got into positions beyond the German lines and captured their field gun positions. The German casualties are always calculated in a slightly different way to ours, and in the official history it quotes a figure of 30,000 for the 21st to the 31st of July. So if you think that that includes the pre-attack bombardment period, when those massive amount of artillery guns on the British and Empire side are bombarding the German lines, that's still a significant figure. And I guess if we extrapolate that data, we could say that as therefore given periods rather than a specific day, probably about 2/3 of both those figures, the 27,000 for the British and 30,000 for the Germans, were probably suffered on the first day of the battle itself, on the 31st of July. Now, I mentioned that this day was a black day in Flanders, the worst day in the fighting around Ypres from the British perspective, British and Empire, Commonwealth perspective, for all 4 years of the war. So what were the casualty figures? So while we have to look at a period of casualties for the British and German sources, what we can do, of course, is look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database online and interrogate that to find out how many men died on the 31st of July 1917. So when we do that, we discover that there were 6,221 casualties who died in Belgium on that date and are either commemorated on a memorial to the missing or are buried in a British and Commonwealth cemetery. So we can pretty safely say that in that fighting around Ypres on the 31st of July 1917, over 6,000 men were killed in a single day. Now, this is a lot lower than the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where nearly 20,000 died, but for Flanders, it's quite a significant figure. If we compare it to previous battles, and again, using the information on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, you can do this. You can put in an area, a country like Belgium, and a specific date, and it'll come up with the figures, with the data. So, looking at other potential dates that could have cost the British Army dear around Ypres during those 4 years, let's look at it chronologically. So on the 31st of October 1914, which was one of the key periods during the First Battle of Ypres, 970 men died on that day, so nearly 1,000. So that wasn't the costliest day. Another one that came to mind was the 8th of May 1915, and that was a crucial period during the Second Battle of Ypres, when units thrown into the line to try and stop the Germans from breaking through and reaching Ypres stood their ground but suffered extensive casualties as a consequence of that. We discovered that on that day, 1,686 men were killed. Another day that came to mind was the 25th of September 1915. Now, that's a day that we would associate with the Battle of Loos, and of course that is the first day of the Battle of Loos. But in Flanders, there was a diversionary attack along the Bellewaerde Ridge. The 14th Light Division, for example, attacked in that area. And on that day, there was 1,618 casualties around Ypres, fatal casualties. So up until that quieter period of 1915-16, there's nothing that really comes close to the casualties that were suffered on the 31st of July 1917. So if we jump on a little bit in later stages of Third Ypres, as the fighting got bogged down in that quagmire of ground and the moonscape, what about some of the other key dates? Well, the 16th of August 1917, that was the crossing of the Steenbeek River. There were 4,089 deaths that day. The Battle of the Menin Road Ridge on the 20th of September, there was 4,647 that day, and in the attack on the Brunseider Ridge, there was 4,996. Now that one comes closer. That's nearly 5,000 men killed in a single day. That's close to the 6,000 plus casualties of the 31st of July, but it still makes the 31st of July that deadly day. What about events in 1918? Well, I had a look at some key dates there connected with the Battle of the Lys on the 9th of April. There were 660 killed that day. I suspect over the wider period of the Battle of the Lys, the fatal casualties would have been much higher, but on a single day, it didn't come anywhere close to the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. And when I looked at some of the later operations in September and October in 1918, in the Fourth Battle of Ypres, the final fighting around Ypres, nothing came anywhere near that. So this pretty much confirms that the 31st of July 1917, for Britain and the Commonwealth, was the worst day of all 4 years in Flanders in terms of fatal casualties, in terms of deaths, with over 6,000 men killed in that single day. Of the deaths that day, and again using the Commonwealth War Graves Commission data, 4,499 of them are commemorated on the Menin Gate. Now that's 72% do not have a known grave. Now when you think that the advance was generally successful and units had moved forward, and by this stage there were divisional burial officers who would come out and follow the advance up and then go out and bury the dead, that's quite surprising, but it could also be indicative of the fact that the whole battlefield was continually shelled for the next 3 and a bit months, and then in April 1918 the Germans swept across this ground again with a huge amount of artillery, and I guess that battlefield burial sites were lost as a consequence of this. So that's the overall picture. Let's get a little bit beneath those figures to try and comprehend them a little bit more and hear about some of the men and some of the units involved and what it cost them. When we look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission data, you can download the information as an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can sort it into different categories, and it's quite a good way of analysing particular dates and particular actions. And from this, if we look at the ranks, we see that the most senior officer that died that day was Brigadier General Alistair Fraser Gordon, who was commanding the 153rd Brigade up on the Pilkelm Ridge on the 31st of July 1917. He was aged 45, he'd served in the Ashanti campaign, and he left behind a wife and family in London. So here we are on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres, and even this late into the war, senior officers are still being killed on the ground. So it wasn't a case that as the war went on, they got further and further back. Many of these men, brigadier generals commanding a brigade, wanted to go forward to accompany their men, to see what was happening, to react to conditions on the ground, and of course in doing so they put themselves in the line of fire in just the same way that anybody else on that battlefield was. In addition to him, there were 8 lieutenant colonels killed that day. These are battalion commanders. There are probably a few majors listed there that were actually acting lieutenant colonels who may well have been battalion commanders, but when we see the rank of lieutenant colonel and they're in an infantry battalion, we know that they're the commanding officer. So we've got at least 8 killed that day, and one of them was Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Mobbs of the 7th Battalion Northamptonshire Regiment. He was a well-known rugby player in Northampton, and they still have a Mobbs match in memory of him. He's one of those commemorated on the Menin Gates at Ypres. When we start to look at individual battalions, and when we look at war diaries, we see that a lot of battalions were going into action on the 31st of July, not with 1,000 officers and men, but on average 500, 600, 700 officers and men, so not necessarily at full strength. And what we see is that there are a lot of battalions, a very, very high proportion of battalions that suffer over 100 men killed on that day, and quite a lot of battalions, more than 200 men killed in action on that day. When we look at particular regiments, we see them well represented amongst the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who had multiple battalions. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers had over 200 dead that day because they had battalions in the Welsh Division attacking across the Pilkelm Ridge, so they suffered quite a few casualties. And the highest of all was the King's Liverpool Regiment, and they had over 480 men killed on the 31st of July 1917. That's almost 10% of the entire total from one regiment. And the reason for that is that there were multiple battalions in the 55th Division attacking towards the Steenbeek, and there was also the POWs, the Liverpool POWs battalions that were on the southern part of the operation, just south of the Menin Road. And it shows just how ferocious that fighting in that southern sector was when you look at the King's Liverpool casualties that day. A very high proportion of them are from those POWs battalions. Breaking this data down even more, we can begin to look at the age of soldiers who were killed on the 31st of July, and we discover that there were 8 17-year-olds who died on the 31st of July 1917. So 8 teenage Tommies, underage soldiers, which again, at a period when you've got conscription, this is perhaps a little bit unusual to have underage soldiers dying, because by this stage no one was stepping forward to volunteer and everyone was conscripted at 18 and then sent overseas. So these 17-year-olds are going to be soldiers who enlisted much earlier in the war, perhaps as early as 1914, which by then, of course, was 3 years previously. So maybe some of these guys enlisted at 14. When looking at the details of those 17-year-olds who died, one immediately stood out to me, and that was Private Isaac Strauss of the 11th South Wales Borderers. He was killed on the Pilkelm Ridge and he's buried at New Irish Farm Cemetery. He enlisted in London and was living in Whitechapel. Strauss is a Germanic name. In fact, actually, he's from Poland. He's Polish. His parents were Polish Jews who had emigrated to Britain before the Great War. His medals were returns as undeliverable. I guess that probably reflects the movement of working-class Jewish families within London at that time. The last known address was not valid. They no longer lived there. They'd moved on. And when his medals were sent there by recorded post, they were sent back as the family had no longer at that address. He's listed in the British Book of Jewry, which was a massive memorial volume that was prepared after the war to commemorate all of the British and Empire Jews who had died in the First World War. It's a mighty tome, a beautiful book that lists them all by unit, and there are photographs of many of them, sadly not one of Private Strauss. So it's interesting that one of the youngest soldiers to die on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres was not originally born in Britain, was of Polish birth, and was part of that rich tapestry of the history of immigration, particularly in places like London, that Britain was famous for in those decades, in that century or more before the First World War. And over the last few years, I've noticed quite a lot of Polish visitors to the battlefields of the Great War, going out to places like Souchez to see the Polish Memorial at La Targette, and the connection of Polish volunteers in the French Foreign Legion, fighting in places like Notre Dame de Lorette and Hill 145, Vimy Ridge, and then further down the front. And perhaps those Polish visitors are not aware how many of their countrymen actually were serving in British units, and a quick scan of soldiers died in the Great War records quite a lot of men whose place of birth is in Poland. So again, it's all part of our wider understanding as to how international really the Army and the British Expeditionary Force had become by this stage in the war. And in some areas of Britain, it had been like that perhaps since the very beginning, reflected in the enlistments of a regiment like the London Regiment, recruited in a place that was so ethnically diverse. If we have young soldiers, what about old soldiers as well? Well, the 2 oldest soldiers to have died on the 31st of July were aged 46. Captain William Dobbs was in the 2nd Battalion Middlesex Regiment. He was an Irishman from County Waterford. He'd been wounded twice before and educated at Winchester College, so had served at the front for quite some time. And Private Ralph Bond from Southport died near Wiltshire in the advance towards the Steenbeek River with the 1st 7th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment. So when we analyse the data from sources like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission like this, it can give us an interesting insight into the many faces of the losses sustained on a single day like this. and give us some idea really as the true scope of casualties and the effect that they had when we break them down by regiment and by area. By this stage, of course, with a conscript army, a Liverpool regiment didn't necessarily mean that every man was from Liverpool. And when we see that among the deads there were men from 17 to 46, we can see how diverse the age range was as a consequence of conscription. By 1918, everyone from 18 to 55 was conscripted. Not all of them ended up in the infantry. A lot of the older men would have been sent to rear echelon units like the Army Service Corps or the Labour Corps. But again, it just shows how when we look at some of these battles, they weren't all young men. Their ages as well as their backgrounds were just as diverse. But with all this talk of casualties, let's see that in sharp focus by getting back on the ground. And we're going to find ourselves at the end of this podcast in Buffs Road Cemetery, just outside the city of Ypres, close to the front lines on the 31st of July 1917. In fact, it sits in no man's land. Its name refers to a road that runs across this part of the battlefield where the Buffs, the East Kent Regiment, had fought during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. But the cemetery, when you go into it, is on the line of advance of the 11th, 12th and 13th Battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment, the South Downs battalions that have always had a particular interest, connection to me, having researched those battalions for many years and back in the 80s and 90s, interviewing the last survivors of them. And I often talk about him in this podcast, one of the veterans of the South Downs, Albert Banfield. Him and his brother kept very detailed diaries which their parents typed up after the war. Particularly poignant for them doing that because his brother Marcus died in April 1918, so he never came home. And the parents transferred their memories of what they'd written in their diaries into this typescript form, which I'm pleased to say is now in the archives of the Royal Sussex Regiment at the West Sussex Records Office in Chichester. But Albert Banfield very kindly gave me a copy of this in the 1980s. So when I read it and I reflect on the times that I went to see him, his voice often echoes in my head when I stand in a place like this, because here at Buffs Road, it's a cemetery that was made after that opening phase of Third Ypres, and later when this ground was slightly away from the fighting, there was a lot of field and then siege gun positions here, so there's quite a few artillerymen buried in here. But there is a very big plot of men from the South Downs battalions who advanced across this ground towards Mousetrap Farm, which we can see in the distance as we come into the cemetery and look to our right. Mousetrap Farm is across the fields there. Beyond that is the village of St Julien and the Steenbeek River, and that's the area where the South Downs were fighting. In fact, in the interwar period, the Ypres League put up a little memorial board to the South Downs battalions in St Julien village, which sadly is no longer there, and it was never replaced by a permanent memorial. But when I stand here, I think of Albert Banfield and his brother Marcus. They were both signallers in the 13th Battalion. This was the 5th time that they had been over the top. This was a different battle to the battles that experienced the year before on the Somme, which so often had ended in disaster with heavy casualties. In particular, they'd both gone over in the attack at the Boar's Head and seen their battalion annihilated. Here their battle was not so much with the Germans, but the attempt to keep their lines of communication, their signalling, in contact with those behind them. So their job was to go forward and establish points where they could take messages from those on the ground and send them back to headquarters behind. And as the advance moved forward and the distances got greater, that became more and more problematic. And Albert remembered sitting there in the rain as the rain came down that afternoon and into that evening with his Lucas lamp flashing back to the rear link where battalion headquarters was, the ping-ping of the rain on his helmet, a noise that whenever in later life he heard it on a tin roof or while standing at a bus stop, instantly transported him back to the Great War, back to places like this, back to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.